as we wrap things up in our call right here, I think that uh, there's a lot when you think about systemic oppression, and I think there's a lot even before when we were talking about this idea of relief and compassion and justice and advocacy in those categories. I feel like when it comes to systemic oppression, there's a lot going on right now. There's a lot of people, as you were saying before, like tweeting out stuff or putting a Facebook update about what they think about certain issues that are happening in the world right now and trying to tackle that down by a post. And you can see a little bit of my annoyance to some of that sometimes. But I feel like when you think about how we're engaging right now, there's lots of ways to engage. When you think about what a Christian is supposed to do to engage in advocacy, I'm curious what your thoughts are, because I remember reading one time um, a, a book by Samuel Wells, and Samuel Wells kind of breaks down four different categories of how to four models of engagement. He says, number one, we could be working for the poor. That's kind of the relief thing. You come and you serve the poor. You do everything and you give. That's working for. And then he says there's the more participatory way of doing things where you're working with. And so you do your part, I do my part. The idea of like participation on both sides, working with. And then it goes to the idea of being with, like that's more the being present with those. That's kind of leans a little bit into the compassion that you were talking about, that category. And then there is the being for. And the being for is like advocating for the cause. And I've seen a lot of forms of that where it seems like not very balanced, in that we're being for causes without necessarily being involved in the issues or having a name or an actual relationship with a person. But my thought is, when I'm talking to you and we're carving out like the theological way of engaging in these things, and what is the nuance, or what is the distinction of a Christian engaging in this? I'm curious your thoughts on that, and I appreciate your time here. So I know we're gonna close soon, but just thoughts on that.
Well, as you know, I'm a fairly big fan of Jeremiah and what Jeremiah says in chapter 22. And he tells the story of Josiah there, who, unlike his son, has a deep investment in justice, and it uses both the term for justice and what we normally think of as a term for righteousness, which is actually simply another Hebrew word for justice. But it says the king practices justice on a kind of a structural level, and he practices justice on a personal level, sadak. And and as it talks about him doing that, he clearly is invested in the well-being of the people.
Hmm.
And if you know the story of Josiah, you know he was considered like this greatest king of Israel, and he did great things. He led spiritual reformation and stuff like that in the
Hmm.
land. But at the end of the passage, it says he pled the cause of the poor and the afflicted, or the Ebion and the oppressed. Ebion being the dependent poor.
Yeah.
It says he pled their cause. And what I like about that is he's pleading their cause out of his action. So in a sense, if I use James as a template, he went and he was with the poor. You know, he's with the poor in their need, and he saw
Visiting.
the need. Yeah, and so and it influenced how he did his work as king.
Hmm.
And after being with the poor, he then pled their cause to the people of the nation. And that word pled translates really well into our concept of advocacy. He advocated for the poor. And it's a very strong passage, because it then ends with this word that says, "Is this not what it means to know me, declares the Lord?"
Hmm.
It's not when he does righteousness and justice
Hmm.
that it says that. It's when he pleads the cause. It says, "Is this not what it means to know me?" Now, another way of maybe getting your mind around that is that you could say, if you're not pleading the cause of the poor, how would you ever dare claim to know God? I mean, that's really what it's saying. And it's a strong passage.
Yeah.
And while it's said positively, is this not what it means to know me, declares the Lord, it's actually a fairly severe warning.
Hmm.
And so the king moves from doing to speaking. And what you're referring to is about people who speak and never do,
Hmm.
and they're never part of a process. And
Yeah.
what in the 60s we used to think of as armchair revolutionaries or armchair activists, and they wrote books and they gave lectures, but they actually weren't. They weren't incarnate. They weren't with the people.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so when God wanted to reach the world, God didn't write a book. Well, he did write a book, but he wanted to when he wanted to really reach the world, he sent his son. He didn't fly over the world with a plane and dump tracks on them. He sent his son, and we get that idea of incarnate.
Oh, wow.
And Josiah, in an Old Testament way, was the incarnate presence of God among the people. And as he did his work, he became the one who pled the cause.
Hmm.
And I think advocacy carries far more power
Wait. Yeah.
when it comes out of those experiences. I think advocacy carries even more power. I used to have a friend named Diane Marshall who used to work at Scott Mission years ago, and she used to work with women. And rather than, in quotes, advocating for the women, and this is the community development theme, she would teach women how to self-advocate. And women from Scott Mission literally would go to Ottawa and go to the Ontario legislature, and they would make their own presentations
Hmm.
about their realities and the plight. And I think maybe part of this advocacy is we who are in very privileged positions encourage the voices of those who may have less privileged positions so that they get to speak with their own voice as opposed to us always speaking for them.
Hmm.
And Josiah is clearly he's speaking for people. Um, but some days that's all you get.